History has a bad habit of repeating itself, but it rarely does so in obvious ways. More often it echoes. The names change, the flags change, the justifications get rewritten, but the logic stays familiar. If we want to understand what is happening in the world right now, especially in the Western Hemisphere, we need to look backward before we look forward. In recent years, and especially in recent months, Venezuela has once again pushed itself to the center of international attention. Accusations of criminality at the highest levels of government, questions about legitimacy, economic collapse, outside pressure framed as law enforcement, humanitarian concern, or regional stability. None of this is new. What is new is how quickly people forget that we have been here before. To understand how the United States thinks about intervention, regime change, and the use of force close to home, there is no better case study than Operation Just Cause. In December of 1989, the U.S. did not declare war. It launched an operation. The target was Manuel Noriega, a foreign head of state accused of drug trafficking, corruption, and threatening American lives and interests. The justification was not conquest, but order. Not occupation, but restoration. Not regime change, at least not officially, but accountability. Sound familiar? Panama was small, Venezuela is not. Panama had the Canal Zone and a long-standing U.S. military presence. Venezuela does not. But the logic behind the action, the belief that removing one man could stabilize a nation, that criminal indictments could justify military force, that speed and decisiveness could prevent wider chaos, those ideas didn't begin in 1989, and they didn't end there either. This isn't about arguing whether Operation Just Cause was right or wrong. Historians are still debating that more than 3 decades later. What matters is that it created a template, a precedent, a playbook that still influences how policymakers, generals, and the public think about intervention in Latin America. So before we argue about today, before we take sides on Venezuela, before we assume that history has moved on, let's go back. Because if you don't understand Panama in 1989, you don't fully understand what you're watching now. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. By the late 1980s, Panama had become a country living in the shadow of a canal that mattered more to the outside world than anything happening inside its borders. The United States has spent decades treating Panama as a strategic extension of American territory, a place where shipping lanes, Cold War anxieties, and intelligence operations all intersected in a narrow strip of land barely wider than a county back home. On paper, the Torrijos-Carter treaties of 1977 promised a smooth handoff of the canal by the end of 1999. In reality, nothing about Panama was ever smooth, and as those deadlines approached, tension simmered into the kind of political chaos that keeps generals awake at night. For years, U.S. intelligence had considered Manuel Noriega a valuable, if deeply distasteful asset. He was the kind of man who could drink coffee with CIA handlers in the morning and shake down drug traffickers by afternoon. As long as he whispered information about Cuba, Nicaragua, and anyone else Washington considered suspicious, his sins were tolerated under the unwritten Cold War rule of, he may be a bastard, but at least he's our bastard. But Noriega grew bolder with every year, wrapping himself in a mix of military uniforms, secret police power, and the confidence of someone who thought he was indispensable. By the mid-80s, the United States finally realized it had built a career on the geopolitical equivalent of storing gunpowder next to a space heater. The Panamanian Defense Forces, the PDF, were nominally the country's military, but functioned more like a personal security company for Noriega. Corruption ran through the ranks, loyalty was purchased rather than earned, and the infamous Dignity Battalions served as street-level enforcers who made dissent physically dangerous. When Panama held elections in 1989, the opposition won in a landslide so obvious that even neutral observers announced the results before the ballots were done being counted. Noriega's response was to tear up the results, unleash his thugs on opposition leaders, and declare himself the man in charge because that's what strongmen do when the illusion of democracy becomes inconvenient. Washington's patience snapped. Between drug trafficking indictments in U.S. courts and Noriega's open attacks on Panamanian democracy, the political debate shifted from, should we intervene, to, what's taking so long? Sanctions dug deep into Panama's already fragile economy, squeezing the country like a vice. The more pressure the U.S. applied, the more erratic Noriega became, and the more the Bush administration found itself juggling national security concerns with the embarrassment of having to confront a dictator who had once been on the payroll. The breaking point arrived on December 16, 1989, when a U.S. Marine, Lieutenant Robert Paz, was killed at a PDF roadblock. Another American officer and his wife were assaulted shortly afterward. These incidents didn't just escalate tensions, they detonated them. The Pentagon had already developed contingency plans, but now the conversation shifted from paperwork to action. Protecting the American personnel became the legal justification, but Noriega himself had become the political centerpiece. The man who once traded intel for money was now wanted in American courts, and the idea of letting him slip away under the cover of diplomatic immunity was something Washington wouldn't tolerate. Behind the scenes, the military machine was already moving. Special operations units rotated quietly into Panama under various pretexts. Reconnaissance intensified, and target folders thickened with floor plans, photographs, and patrol schedules. These preparations weren't subtle, they were simply concealed behind the noise of ordinary military activity that had been part of Panama's landscape for decades. Local civilians could sense something building, but the scale of what was coming was unimaginable. The United States framed its objectives in a tidy list: protect American lives, defend democracy, secure the canal, combat drug trafficking, and bring Noriega to justice. But the operation was driven by something more elemental, the hard lesson that letting a dictator operate as both ally and criminal eventually forces a reckoning. By the time December turned into winter, the political question was settled, the military was positioned, and the only thing left was to decide when the lights would go out in Panama and the invasion would begin. When Operation Just Cause finally shifted from planning to execution, the United States assembled a strike package that looked less like a regional intervention and more like a miniature blueprint of the entire American military machine. It was a coalition of airborne divisions, Rangers, Special Operations Forces, armored units, aviation brigades, psychological operations team, and military police, all moving toward a country smaller than South Carolina. If Noriega ever wondered how seriously Washington wanted him gone, the answer arrived in the form of 27,000 troops prepared to land on his doorstep in the middle of the night. Roughly half of that force was already in Panama under U.S. Southern Command. They lived on bases near the canal, trained in the local terrain, and knew every bend, bridge, and barrio worth worrying about. The other half would be inserted rapidly once the operation began, forming a deployment tempo that made the entire invasion feel less like a buildup and more like someone flipping a switch marked full send. The 18th Airborne Corps held overall command, pulling in assets from across the Army to create a force built for speed and dominance. The 82nd Airborne Division provided mass, the kind of rapid infantry surge that could seize ground faster than the PDF could figure out where the shooting was coming from. But the sharpest blade in the toolbox was the 75th Ranger Regiment. Their job wasn't to hold terrain, it was to seize the airfields at Rio Hato and Torrijos Tocumen, so that follow-on forces could land without turning their C-141s into very expensive lawn darts. Rangers specialize in violence delivered with stopwatch precision, and Panama was about to become a demonstration of exactly how they could make an entire airport change owners. Then came the Special Operations community, which was preparing for its largest deployment in U.S. history to that point. Delta Force had the unenviable task of finding Noriega and removing him from the board before he could disappear behind diplomatic walls. Navy SEALs were assigned to neutralize Noriega's mobility: boats, aircraft, anything that allowed him to flee the country faster than paperwork could keep up. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, provided the kind of low-level helicopter insertions that only make sense when flying at treetop height in the dark is considered an acceptable workplace hazard. The 7th Special Forces Group handled reconnaissance and liaison work, the kind that never gets Hollywood treatment, but determines whether the guys kicking in the doors get to walk out afterward. Psychological operations teams were embedded early, prepared to shape information and demoralize PDF units. Civil affairs units stood by to manage the aftermath when the shooting stopped and the politics began. On the other side of the battlefield, the Panamanian Defense Forces looked less like a military and more like a collection of government employees whose job happened to involve carrying rifles. The entire PDF numbered around 3,500 troops, but only a few hundred of them, like Battalion 2000 and the Macho de Monte Commandos, represented anything resembling a professional fighting force. Their equipment was outdated, their training inconsistent, and their morale eroded by corruption and the international humiliation. Panama City was their home turf, but even the advantage of local familiarity couldn't compensate for the fact that the U.S. was bringing overwhelming night vision capability, air dominance, and a precision strike capability that the PDF simply had no answer for. Intelligence analysts assessed that the PDF would resist sharply in isolated pockets, but lacked the cohesion amount of long-term defense. The greater risk wasn't military, it was civilian. Much of the fighting would occur in densely populated urban areas where stray bullets had a habit of rewriting family histories. Securing the canal was straightforward. Preventing the operation from turning into a humanitarian disaster would require careful coordination and the tolerance for chaos. Geography further complicated the equation. The canal zone wasn't just a waterway, it was a nerve center surrounded by cities, slums, military outposts, embassies, and industrial districts shoved together like parts in an overstuffed toolbox. Seizing airports meant controlling the skies. Controlling the skies meant controlling the ground. Controlling the ground meant getting to Noriega before he could vanish deeper than a rat in a sewer pipe. What emerged wasn't simply a plan to remove a dictator. It was a joint operation designed to demonstrate exactly how fast the U.S. could mobilize in the post-Vietnam era. Every branch, every specialty, every doctrine was about to be thrown into a single showcase of modern American power. The message was clear. Noriega might have spent years believing he was untouchable, but Washington was about to deploy enough combat power to prove that no amount of swagger or secrecy could protect him once the United States decided the game was over. The invasion of Panama didn't begin with a crawl or a warning shot. It began with a kind of synchronized violence that only a country with the world's largest military budget can deliver at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning. For months, Washington had been tightening the screws, building the pressure, and positioning assets, but once the decision was made, Operation Just Cause unfolded like someone hitting an unpause button on a war that had been waiting backstage. Within seconds of the designated start time, the night sky over Panama lit up with the glow of tracers, helicopter rotors, and the cold, steady discipline of a force that had rehearsed every moment down to the minute. The Rangers were the first major hammer to fall. Their mission? Seize the airfields at Rio Hato and Torrijos Tacuben so thoroughly and so quickly that the Panamanian defense forces wouldn't even have time to decide whether retreat was an option. At Rio Hato, Battalion 2000, one of Noriega's few competent units, was dug in and ready to fight. What they weren't ready for was an AC-130 gunship, turning the pre-landing moments into an aerial sledgehammer demonstration. The Rangers jumped under fire, descended into the chaos, and immediately began breaking the defenders' positions apart with short, violent bursts of small arms fire. Battalion 2000 put up a determined resistance, but the combination of air power, surprise, and Ranger aggression turned the fight into a losing proposition within minutes. At Torrijos and Tacuben, the pattern repeated. Once the Rangers had the perimeter under control, aircraft from the 82nd Airborne Division began dropping troopers through the night sky, transforming the airports from potential defensive positions into U.S.-controlled logistics hubs. Heavy equipment, vehicles, and follow-on forces could now flow into Panama as steadily as freight rolling off a factory line. For the PDF, losing the airports wasn't just a tactical setback. It severed their ability to maneuver or resupply, leaving them stranded in a battlefield that was shrinking around them. While the paratroopers dominated the skies and runways, the Navy SEALs struck Panama's coastlines and marinas. Their objective was simple: keep Noriega from fleeing by water or air. SEAL Team 4 hit the gunboats at Colon and Balboa, sinking or disabling them before the crews fully understood what was happening. SEAL Team 2 moved to take out Noriega's private Learjet, but the mission turned into one of the most costly moments of the night. The team encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance, tightened engagement zones, and limited cover. By the time the shooting stopped, several SEALs were dead, one of the rare but painful reminders that even well-planned operations demand a price. Meanwhile, Delta Force began its series of high-value raids, sweeping through Noriega's known residences, safe houses, and command centers. The problem wasn't capability, it was timing. Noriega had a habit of changing locations like a paranoid raccoon rotating between garbage cans. By the time Delta breached his doors, he was already gone, leaving behind empty rooms, scattered documents, and the lingering smell of someone who believed he could outrun an entire nation's military. Panama City erupted into firefights as U.S. forces targeted La Comandancia, the nerve center of the PDF. AC-130s pounded the compound with surgical violence, collapsing walls and igniting fires that quickly spread through the surrounding neighborhood. Street-level resistance broke out in bursts, ambushes by Dignity battalions, isolated PDF holdouts firing from windows, and small pockets of loyalists trying to make a stand. But these engagements were speed bumps, not roadblocks. The United States had entered the city with overwhelming night vision superiority, coordinated air support, and units trained to fight in environments far nastier than Panama's narrow streets. Within the first 12 hours, the strategic landscape shifted completely. Airports secured, PDF headquarters disabled, key bridges, military installations, and communications nodes under U.S. control. Noriega's command structure shattered like a plate dropped from a rooftop. The dictator himself had slipped through the cracks, but the machinery that kept him in power was now rubble and smoke. The invasion had begun with a single synchronized strike, but the message delivered in that opening hour echoed far louder. The United States had arrived in force, and the question was no longer whether Noriega could hold power. It was how long he could hide before the net closed around him. In the first hours after the invasion began, Panama City became a patchwork of chaos, resistance, and shock as the U.S. military crashed through the core of Noriega's power. The city wasn't built for clean warfare. It was a tight mesh of poor neighborhoods, government districts, industrial strips, and colonial relics crammed together like a maze where every alley could be a dead end or a firing position. This was the heart of the Panamanian Defense Forces, and inside that heart sat La Comandancia, a fortress-like headquarters that symbolized Noriega's authority. Knocking it out wasn't optional. It was the key to breaking whatever discipline the PDF still had left. The assault began with the unmistakable silhouette of an AC-130 circling overhead, its cannons methodically tearing into the complex with a rhythm that made the streets below vibrate. Precision or not, firepower of that magnitude is impossible to confine neatly, and secondary fires quickly spread from the compound into the surrounding El Chorrillo neighborhood. Residents fled as flames climbed apartment walls, turning the densely packed district into a glowing reminder that urban warfare never keeps to the script. For the PDF troops inside La Comandancia, the bombardment shattered their defensive posture, but the survivors still fought on, firing for broken windows and rubble as U.S. infantry forces closed in. Street-level engagements erupted throughout the city as U.S. units pushed outward from their objectives. Dignity battalions, Noriega's paramilitary street enforcers, attempted hit-and-run ambushes, hoping that quick bursts of fire would slow the American advance. But they were no match for well-coordinated infantry, backed by armor, helicopters, and night vision capabilities that turned the darkness into a tactical advantage. The narrow streets limited the movement of vehicles, but not the discipline of the troops moving through them. Every doorway was treated as a potential threat, every rooftop a possible sniper perch, and every intersection another place where an armored column might get raked by small arms fire. The PDF's resistance was uneven. Some units surrendered almost immediately, realizing the fight was hopeless. Others, particularly Macho Diamante commandos and loyalists near government buildings, fought with every determination to momentarily stall U.S. advances. But the asymmetry of the battle was impossible to ignore. The United States wasn't probing Panama City. It was overwhelming it, block by block, with a tempo that prevented the PDF from regrouping or consolidating anywhere for more than a few minutes. Without coherent leadership and with communications collapsing, the defenders fought in disconnected fragments, each firefight resembling its own small war, disconnected from the larger one swallowing the city. As La Comandancia burned and the PDF structure collapsed, the civilian landscape shifted rapidly. Fear gave way not just to displacement, but to opportunism. With the police forces gone and the military either arrested or fleeing, looting ignited across several neighborhoods. Electronic stores, grocery markets, and even government buildings were stripped clean. U.S. troops suddenly found themselves not just fighting armed combatants, but navigating a civilian population that had been thrown into full social freefall. Restoring order became as urgent as rooting out the remaining PDF pockets. Military police units moved in to stabilize key intersections and deter looters, but the scale of disorder stretched thin any immediate response. Civil affairs teams began coordinating with Panamanian officials to shelter displaced residents, though that task was complicated by the fact that many government agencies barely functioned after Noriega's loyalists abandoned their posts. The collateral damage became both a public relations and humanitarian burden, highlighted by the rising smoke columns visible across the city. Meanwhile, foreign journalists descended on Panama with the enthusiasm of vultures spotting movement on the ground. CNN's cameras captured burning buildings, tracer fire, and civilians running through the streets. Imagery broadcast globally in real time. For the first time, Americans watched an invasion unfold as it happened, with anchors narrating events faster than Pentagon press officers could process them. The battle for Panama City was now also a battle for how the world perceived U.S. power. By the end of the first full day, Panama City no longer resembled the capital that Noriega claimed to control. Government buildings had been secured, PDF headquarters lay in ruins, and remaining defenders were either fleeing, hiding, or attempting scattered counterattacks that dissolved almost as quickly as they formed. What remained was a city in shock, half liberated, half burning, and fully aware that the old order had collapsed overnight. The dictator was still missing, but his fortress had fallen, his troops were scattered, and the streets he once patrolled with impunity now belonged to someone else. The search for Noriega was about to begin in earnest, and the political heart of Panama had already changed hands. For all the firepower, precision, and shock that marked the opening day of Operation Just Cause, the one man whose downfall justified the entire operation simply vanished into the night. Manuel Noriega had built a career on paranoia, deception, and the ability to slip through cracks that other men never noticed. When U.S. forces shattered the PDF and leveled La Comandancia, they destroyed the machinery of his power. But Noriega himself was nowhere near the rubble. What followed wasn't just a military pursuit, it was a manhunt layered with politics, intelligence work, misdirection, and an increasingly desperate dictator who was running out of hiding places. The first wave of Delta Force raids hit his known residences within hours of the invasion. These weren't quiet entries, they were dynamic assaults backed by intelligence that suggested Noriega slept in one of several compounds, each outfitted with safes, secure rooms, and escape routes. But by the time operators breached the doors, the dictator had already slipped away. In some cases, the beds were still warm. In others, food sat half-eaten on tables. Noriega moved constantly, sometimes changing locations multiple times per day, relying on loyalists who still believed he could somehow negotiate his way back into power if he stayed alive long enough. As U.S. forces expanded their control of Panama City, they dismantled the network that Noriega relied on to stay concealed. Communication centers were seized, PDF officers were arrested or interrogated, and informants emerged from the chaos, some motivated by patriotism, others by the simple realization that Noriega's era had ended and the smart money abandoned him. Every checkpoint tightened the noose, limiting his options. The dictator who once operated with confidence now lived in a shrinking bubble defined by fear, disguises, and a handful of safe houses that were becoming less safe by the hour. Rumors spread across the city about where he might be. Some claimed he had fled to the mountains. Others said he was preparing to slip onto a fishing boat under the cover of darkness. There were even whispers that he'd secured a plane waiting on a rural airstrip, ready to bolt toward Cuba. But these were fragments of a man losing control, and U.S. intelligence filtered through the noise with increasing precision. Every time Noriega tried to reposition, someone saw him. Every time he called in a favor, someone reported it. And every time he hid, the United States moved one step closer. The turning point came when Noriega abandoned the idea of escape and sought refuge in the apostolic Nuncature, the Vatican embassy in Panama City. It was, legally speaking, sacred ground. U.S. forces couldn't storm it without triggering an international incident, and Noriega knew it. The moment he stepped inside, the manhunt shifted from direct action to psychological warfare. The world now watched a bizarre spectacle. A dictator in a religious sanctuary, surrounded by clergy who didn't want him there, and troops who couldn't touch him. If Noriega hoped the Vatican would shield him indefinitely, he misunderstood the patience of the United States. Psychological operations teams moved into place, surrounding the compound with speakers that blasted music at volumes meant to shake sleep from the building's walls. Most people remember the heavy metal legend that the U.S. military rocked Noriega into surrender with non-stop blasting of I Fought the Law and Van Halen. The truth is less theatrical, but still effective. The playlists varied, the volume was oppressive, and the pressure was unrelenting. Whether or not the music alone wore him down, it ensured the situation stayed in the public spotlight and reminded Noriega that the world was laughing at him. Inside the embassy, Vatican officials found themselves hosting the world's most unwanted house guest. Noriega paced nervously, prayed, argued, and tried to negotiate. He was no longer a general or a head of state. He was a cornered criminal, hoping someone, somewhere, still owed him a favor. But favorable terms never came. Each passing day tightened both diplomatic and psychological pressure, and the realization settled in. The embassy offered the only temporary shelter. Outside waited a superpower that wasn't going home without him. As the manhunt shifted from the streets to the standoff at the Nuncature, the final chapter of Noriega's regime began to take shape. The dictator had avoided capture, but he hadn't escaped. He was boxed in, isolated, and surrounded by a military that had dismantled his entire world in a matter of hours. Now came the waiting game, and Noriega's confidence, once his greatest weapon, was starting to crack. By the final days of December 1989, Operation Just Cause had accomplished almost everything the Pentagon had planned for, except a single objective the world was fixated on. Noriega was no longer commanding troops, issuing orders, or even pretending to lead a government. He was a fugitive tucked inside the apostolic Nuncature, a man who once strutted across parade grounds, now reduced to pacing embassy hallways like a caged animal. The United States held Panama City, the PDF had collapsed, the Canal Zone was secure, and a new government had been installed. What remained was the unfinished business of putting Noriega in American custody, and Washington wasn't about to let the operation end with the most wanted man in the hemisphere sipping coffee under diplomatic protection. The standoff dragged into the second week, and each day made the Vatican more uncomfortable with their uninvited guest. The nunciature was not built to house a head of state, let alone one under indictment for drug trafficking. Noriega slept in a small room. The priests endured a surreal mix of pastoral duty, political pressure, and the persistent low-frequency hum of U.S. military activity outside the gates. Every option for escape, legal or physical, had evaporated. No friendly nation stepped forward, no diplomatic compromise emerged. Noriega had spent years balancing between superpowers, cartels, and regional politics, but now no one wanted the responsibility of protecting him. Outside, psychological pressure replaced gunfire. Large speakers continued their sonic assault, not as a weapon of pain, but as a reminder that the man inside was no longer feared. It wasn't the volume alone, it was the humiliation. A former dictator reduced to hiding from music and mockery made for a humiliating image broadcast around the world. U.S. forces rotated shifts, maintained perimeter security, and waited with the patience of a force that knew time favored them. Inside, the Catholic officials attempted to mediate the situation, urging Noriega towards surrender. They weren't interested in harboring a fugitive indefinitely, nor in becoming the center of an international standoff. Each conversation chipped away at Noriega's resolve. He asked for guarantees the United States would not kill him, for assurances about fair treatment, for any condition that would allow him to maintain a shred of dignity. The priests relayed messages, but the U.S. position remained firm. He would face the American justice system he had been dodging for years. On January 3, 1990, Noriega finally caved. The psychological pressure, the international scrutiny, and the futility of his situation converged into a moment of resignation. He emerged from the nunciature wearing his dress uniform, a final theatrical gesture from a man who had always relied on costume to reinforce authority. But now the uniform signaled surrender, not power. U.S. Marshals, not soldiers, took custody of him, an international legal framing that underscored his status as a criminal defendant rather than a prisoner of war. He was flown out of Panama within hours, delivered into the American legal system he had spent decades undermining. With Noriega gone, the political transition accelerated. Guillermo Endara, whose election victory earlier in the year had been nullified by Noriega, had already been sworn in on the night the invasion began. An odd ceremony conducted inside a U.S. base because Panama's political system had been too volatile to host a peaceful transfer of power. Now, with the dictator removed and the PDF dismantled, Endara's government could begin operating openly in Panama City rather than from behind American protective lines. The Panamanian Defense Forces were formally dissolved, replaced by a new public forces intended to remove the militarized influence that had haunted the country for decades. U.S. advisors assisted with training, restructuring, and security stabilization, marking the shift from combat operations to what became Operation Promote Liberty, an extended period of nation stabilization that would stretch well into the 1990s. For the United States, the end of Just Cause came with a mixture of triumph and scrutiny. Militarily, the operation had been swift and overwhelmingly effective. Politically, it raised questions about precedent, sovereignty, and the costs of intervention. But the immediate result was clear. Panama was no longer under the control of a man who had turned the country into his personal empire. With Noriega in custody, the military objectives fulfilled, and the new government installed, Operation Just Cause officially drew to a close. The guns quieted, the streets slowly regained order, and Panama began the long process of rebuilding from both the rubble of the PDF and the shadow of the man who had once ruled it. For all its speed and precision, Operation Just Cause carried a human cost far heavier than the clean, decisive narrative presented in official briefings. Once the shooting stopped and the smoke lifted over Panama City, the scale of destruction, physical, political, and moral, became impossible to ignore. The United States had achieved its military objectives with overwhelming force, but the aftermath exposed fractures that would feed debate for decades. American casualties were relatively low by historical standards. 23 U.S. service members killed and roughly 325 wounded. In a large-scale urban invasion against a dug-in military force, those numbers were considered proof of tactical superiority. But statistics fail to capture the suddenness with which those losses unfolded. The soldiers killed in the initial Ranger and SEAL assaults paid the steepest price for the operation's tempo. Their deaths became the somber counterweight to an invasion that Washington promoted as efficient, justified, and necessary. Panamanian casualties were far more complicated to quantify. Official U.S. figures estimated around 200 to 300 PDF troops killed, but civilian casualties quickly became a flashpoint. The U.S. maintained the number was approximately 200. Human rights organizations argued the real figure was far higher, some placing the estimate near 500, others pushing it past 1,000. Part of the discrepancy came from the destroyed neighborhoods like El Chorrillo, where fires from the assault on La Comandancia consumed entire city blocks. When homes burn, records vanish, and bodies are not always found. The lack of reliable data created a vacuum that advocacy groups, journalists, and government agencies all attempted to fill, each generating numbers that reflected its own credibility or suspicion. Infrastructure losses were equally uneven. Military targets were hit with precision, but the surrounding civilian areas suffered collateral damage that would take years to repair. El Chorrillo became the most visible symbol, a dense working-class district reduced to charred concrete, twisted metal, and families fleeing with whatever belongings they could carry. Thousands were displaced, creating an internal humanitarian crisis that the Panamanian government was too fractured to handle alone. U.S. civil affairs units and aid organizations moved in quickly, but rebuilding a neighborhood erased by fire is a job measured in years, not months. Internationally, the operation sparked a fierce debate about legality. Washington presented a multi-pronged justification, defending the Canal Treaties, protecting American citizens, countering drug trafficking, and restoring the legitimate Panamanian government. The Organization of American States, however, condemned the invasion as a violation of sovereignty. The United Nations General Assembly followed with a resolution declaring the action a flagrant violation of international law. These statements had no binding force, but they revealed deep discomfort with the precedent of removing a foreign leader through overt military action. Supporters of the operation argued that Noriega's dictatorship had already shredded Panama's sovereignty long before the first American boot hit the ground. Critics countered that if the United States wanted him extradited, there were diplomatic channels that did not involve levering major sections of a capital city. The dispute became a proxy argument for broader questions about American power. How far can a superpower go in the name of stability? And who gets to decide when intervention is necessary? The legal aftermath added another layer of complexity. When Noriega was brought to the United States, courts faced an extraordinary scenario. A foreign head of state captured by military force, but tried in civilian court. The judges upheld the prosecution, declaring that since U.S. indictments predated the invasion, his capture did not violate due process. It was a ruling that satisfied legal procedure, while sidestepping the geopolitical implications of how he arrived in Florida wearing handcuffs. Back home, the American public largely supported the operation. The quick victory, low U.S. casualties, and dramatic capture of Noriega generated approval ratings that strengthened President Bush's political standing. But among scholars, human rights groups, and international observers, the invasion became a case study in contradictions. Tactically brilliant, strategically forceful, but ethically murky. Operation Just Cause achieved what it set out to do, but it left a trail of questions behind. Questions about proportionality, interventionism, and the invisible price civilians pay when war arrives overnight. Those questions would linger long after Noriega was sitting in a Miami jail cell, and they would echo in every debate about U.S. foreign policy for years to come. Operation Just Cause wasn't just a regional conflict or a quick removal of a hostile dictator. It was a proving ground for the American military at the dawn of a new era. The Cold War was winding down, Desert Storm was 1 year away, and the U.S. defense establishment was quietly redefining what modern warfare looked like. Panama became the laboratory, and the results would shape doctrine, organization, and operational thinking for the next several decades. The most striking lesson came from the sheer efficiency of joint operations. For years, the branches of the U.S. military had behaved like rival siblings, forced to share a toolbox, cooperative in theory, territorial in practice. Panama showed what happened when they finally stopped competing and operated as a single, synchronized machine. Airborne forces secured airfields, Rangers seized critical terrain, Marines provided perimeter stability, Air Force assets delivered overwhelming night firepower, Special Operations Forces hunted high-value targets, and military police stabilized captured zones. It wasn't perfect, but it was the closest the U.S. had ever come to the seamless joint warfare vision promoted in the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. What had once been wishful Pentagon theory was now undeniable battlefield proof. The dominance of night operations became another defining takeaway. The U.S. military owned the darkness in Panama. Night vision goggles, AC-130 gunships, infrared targeting, and the 160 SOARS treetop-level helicopter insertions turned the night into an asymmetric advantage. PDF troops often fired blindly into the dark, while American soldiers moved with a confidence that made engagements brutally one-sided. After Panama, night operations proficiency went from a specialty skill to a baseline expectation across the force. Doctrine shifted to assume the U.S. would fight when it was most advantageous, not when the sun was up. Urban warfare also received a harsh but valuable spotlight. Streets, slums, industrial patches, and dense neighborhoods like El Chorrillo forced U.S. troops to confront the complexities of fighting in a populated urban environments. Clearing houses, securing intersections, and dealing with civilian presence created a host of tactical challenges that weren't present on clean, open battlefields. The lessons learned in Panama would be echoed and expanded during operations in Mogadishu, Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul. Panama didn't invent American urban doctrine, but it accelerated its evolution by demonstrating that modern conflict increasingly unfolded in cities, not jungles or deserts. Psychological operations also came out of the invasion with newfound prominence. Before Panama, PSYOP was a niche capability, useful but undervalued. After Panama, it became clear that shaping perception, eroding morale, and controlling information could influence the battlefield as powerfully as bombs and bullets. Radio broadcasts urged PDF troops to surrender. Leaflets explained how to avoid being mistaken for combatants. Loudspeakers persuaded entire units to abandon positions. And of course, the infamous music barrage at the Vatican Embassy became an accidental global advertisement for the psychological dimension of warfare. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about showing that influence operations could achieve strategic effects without firing a shot. Special Operations Forces, in particular, emerged from Panama with heightened status. Delta Force, SEAL teams, and the 160th SOAR had demonstrated their ability to integrate with conventional forces in a large-scale operation. Even when missions didn't go perfectly, such as the SEAL casualties during the assault on Noriega's aircraft, the larger picture was clear. SOF wasn't just an accessory to conventional power, it was an essential component of it. The emphasis on surgical raids, small unit precision, and high-value targeting foreshadowed the SOF-heavy campaigns that would dominate American strategy after 9/11. Finally, Operation Just Cause validated the concept of rapid dominance, hitting fast, hitting hard, and creating enough shock that resistance collapses before it coheres. The Pentagon saw Panama as evidence that overwhelming force, applied in a compressed window, could topple a regime with minimal U.S. casualties. A year later, Desert Storm would repeat the formula on a dramatically larger scale. In retrospect, Just Cause became the bridge between the post-Vietnam military and the high-tech, precision-driven force that would dominate the 1990s and early 2000s. It showed what the U.S. military could do when its components acted as one system, when technology magnified capability, and when strategic surprise met operational precision. The invasion had been small by global standards, but the doctrinal shockwaves were anything but. Panama wasn't just a battle, it was the blueprint for America's next generation of warfare. When the gunfire finally tapered off and the streets of Panama City settled into an uneasy quiet, the country awoke to a new reality. Noriega was gone, the PDF was dismantled, and the nation was free in a way it hadn't been for decades. But freedom arrived wrapped in uncertainty, displacement, and a political landscape that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Operation Just Cause had removed the dictator, but it had also torn down the only central authority most Panamanians had ever known. Now came the harder task, stitching the country back together. The new president, Guillermo Endara, had technically been elected months earlier in a landslide that Noriega tried to erase by force. Being sworn in inside a U.S. military base during the first night of the invasion didn't exactly project the image of a sovereign leader, but once Noriega was captured, Endara's government could finally move into Panama City and begin functioning as a real administration rather than an exiled idea. Their first challenges were immediate and overwhelming. Re-establish basic services, restore public trust, and prove that the new government wasn't simply an American puppet wearing civilian clothes. One of the most pressing crises was humanitarian. Neighborhoods like El Chorrillo had been reduced to ash and twisted steel, and thousands of residents found themselves displaced overnight. Makeshift shelters sprang up, managed jointly by local groups, aid organizations, and U.S. civil affairs units. Families filtered through ruined streets searching for relatives, belongings, or any piece of their lives untouched by the fires. For many, the end of Noriega didn't feel like liberation. It felt like loss, grief, and the heavy cost of someone else's war landing at their doorstep. The Panamanian Defense Forces, once the backbone of Noriega's regime, were dissolved almost immediately. This wasn't just a symbolic decision, it was a structural one. Panama's military had long been the political engine that elevated strongmen and suppressed dissent. Removing it meant the country would now rely on civilian policing and public security forces instead of an army prone to coups. U.S. advisors worked closely with newly designated Panamanian public forces to retain personnel, establish professional standards, and build an organization that answered to elected leaders instead of shadowy intelligence networks. Public opinion toward the United States in the immediate aftermath was complicated and varied. Many Panamanians celebrated the removal of a dictator who had ruled through fear, intimidation, and corruption. Others were furious that their capital had been turned into a battlefield. Still others felt both emotions at once, grateful for the end of Noriega's rule, but resentful of the destruction required to achieve it. The invasion didn't just remove a government, it split public sentiment into factions that would take years to reconcile. Economically, Panama faced the challenge of stabilizing a system that had been strangled by sanctions and warped by decades of military corruption. Banks had shut down during the crisis, foreign investment had fled, and entire sectors depended on informal networks tied to the PDF. Rebuilding confidence required transparency, modernization, and a government strong enough to distance itself from the abuses of the past. The canal, still under U.S. operational control until 1999, remained the country's most valuable economic engine, but repairing internal structures was just as vital. Politically, the Endara administration attempted to assert legitimacy by restoring civil liberties, reopening newspapers that Noriega had shut down, and inviting international observers to monitor the transitional process. But legitimacy doesn't spring up simply because a dictator falls. It had to be earned, and the government spent years navigating a cautious relationship with a population that believed in democracy but feared instability. Social reform became a long-term project. Civilian policing needed to be demilitarized. Education and healthcare systems, neglected during Noriega's era, needed reinvestment. The justice system had to handle not just ordinary crime, but the inevitable wave of accusations, trials, and reconciliations tied to the former regime. Some Panamanians wanted retribution, others preferred amnesty to avoid reigniting old feuds. Balancing these impulses required political finesse and no small amount of patience. Yet despite the destruction and uncertainty, something new began to emerge, a sense that Panama could finally define itself without the looming presence of an uninformed strongman. Corruption didn't vanish, and challenges didn't disappear, but the rigid vertical power structure that had dominated the country for decades was finally broken. In the years following Noriega's fall, Panama slowly stabilized. Elections were held without military interference, civil society reawakened alongside economic growth. By the late 1990s, the country had begun to show signs of becoming one of the more stable democracies in Latin America. Panama's scars didn't fade quickly, but they marked the start of a new trajectory, one shaped not by decrees from a dictator's bunker, but by the difficult, messy work of rebuilding a nation whose future was finally its own to determine. Manuel Noriega's capture ended his reign, but the end of his power did not mean the end of his story. When U.S. Marshals escorted him onto the aircraft bound for Florida, the image echoed worldwide. The man who once controlled Panama with an iron fist was now a prisoner on his way to stand before judges he had mocked for years. His fall from power was dramatic, but his journey through the judicial and political labyrinth that followed was equally significant, reshaping international law, U.S. foreign policy precedent, and Panama's understanding of its own past. Upon arrival in Miami, Noriega entered a legal process unlike anything the United States had handled before. He wasn't a typical defendant. He was a foreign head of state captured through military force and delivered directly into the American justice system. His defense lawyers immediately challenged the legitimacy of his capture, arguing that the United States had violated international law and due process. But the courts ruled that because the U.S. indictments for drug trafficking and racketeering predated the invasion, and because he was not abducted from a territory where the U.S. had no legal standing, the prosecution could proceed. This was a landmark moment in international criminal justice. The U.S. judiciary effectively held that a sovereign leader could be tried in American courts if he had violated American laws, regardless of how he arrived on U.S. soil. Critics argued it set a dangerous precedent for future interventions. Supporters claimed it demonstrated that dictators could be held accountable even when political power shielded them at home. Noriega's trial began in 1991 and quickly became a media spectacle. Prosecutors portrayed him as a cartel-linked strongman who traded intelligence for profit and used Panama as a trafficking pipeline. Witnesses included former associates, DEA agents, and drug traffickers who had cut deals in exchange for testimony. The evidence painted a picture of a man who thrived in the shadows, profiting from an ecosystem of bribery, extortion, and backdoor deals. Noriega, once feared and respected, now sat in a courtroom listening to some of his closest allies detail his criminal empire in exchange for lighter sentences. In 1992, he was convicted on multiple counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. But another twist emerged. The court granted Noriega the legal status of a prisoner of war under the Geneva Conventions. It was an extraordinary designation for a man being tried in civilian court. The POW status didn't change his sentence, but it dictated the conditions of his confinement: cleaner facilities, better treatment, and protections against certain types of interrogation. It also complicated future extradition requests, since POWs cannot be transferred arbitrarily between jurisdictions without proper legal review. He served most of his sentence at the Federal Correction Institution in Miami, where he lived a quiet, controlled life far removed from the chaos he once commanded. He reportedly spent his time reading the Bible, writing letters, and reflecting on the political fall that had turned him from an intelligence asset into an international pariah. For many Americans, he faded from view once imprisoned. For Panamanians, he remained the specter of a past they were trying to escape. When his U.S. sentence ended in 2007, France requested extradition to try him for money laundering tied to properties he had funded with illicit profits. After years of legal wrangling, complicated by his POW status, he was sent to Paris, where he was again convicted. By the time France was finished with him, Panama requested his return to face charges for crimes committed during his rule. In 2011, he finally returned to his homeland, not as a president, but as a prisoner awaiting justice in the courts of the country he had once dominated. Noriega suffered from health issues during his final years, including strokes and cancer. In 2017, following complications from surgery, he died in a Panama City hospital at age 83. His death closed the final chapter of a life defined by duality: intelligence asset and dictator, criminal and ally, military ruler and POW. His legacy is equally divided. To the United States, he became a cautionary tale about the risks of empowering unstable strongmen in the name of geopolitical convenience. To Panama, he remains a symbol of corruption, repression, and the dangers of merging military power with political ambition. And to historians, he represents the messy contradictions of Cold War-era realpolitik, a man created by the system that ultimately destroyed him. Even as combat operations unfolded across Panama, another battle was playing out in real time. One fought not with rifles or AC-130s, but with cameras, satellite feeds, radio broadcasts, and headlines racing around the world faster than any military unit on the ground. Operation Just Cause marked the emergence of a new era in warfare, where public perception became a strategic front and the media acted as an uninvited but unavoidable participant in the conflict. CNN, barely a decade old, found itself at the center of a historic moment. For the first time, Americans watched an invasion as it happened, complete with nighttime firefights, tracer streams arcing over city blocks, and burning neighborhoods displayed on living room televisions before official briefings could catch up. The 24-hour news cycle, still a novelty, became an amplifier for both U.S. triumphs and U.S. missteps. Pentagon spokesman discovered that controlling the message was nearly impossible when journalists were already broadcasting scenes that no carefully worded statement could soften. Viewers weren't waiting for summaries, they were watching the story write itself. Inside the country, the American public largely responded with approval. The operation was framed as a clean, decisive strike against a criminal dictator who had embarrassed and defied the United States for years. Images of Rangers parachuting through the darkness and SEALs disabling Noriega's escape routes carried a cinematic quality that reinforced the perception of competence and justice. The swift capture of airports, the collapse of the PDF, and the increasingly absurd spectacle of Noriega hiding in the Vatican embassy made the invasion feel, to many Americans, like a necessary correction rather than an act of aggression. In Latin America and parts of Europe, however, the reaction was different. Newspapers in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Madrid ran headlines condemning the invasion as a violation of sovereignty. Commentators argued that if Washington wanted Noriega extradited, diplomacy, not tanks, should have been the tool of choice. Footage of burning neighborhoods, displaced families, and civilian casualties fueled accusations that the U.S. had used a sledgehammer to capture a single man. Washington defended its actions as morally and legally justified, but the optics of a superpower toppling a smaller nation in a single night made many foreign governments uneasy. Propaganda, both formal and informal, played a significant role in shaping these narratives. U.S. psychological operations teams broadcast surrender instructions over radio frequencies, distributed leaflets explaining safe conduct, and pushed messages designed to demoralize PDF units. These broadcasts emphasized that resistance was futile and that Noriega's hold on power was collapsing. The campaign aimed to reduce casualties by convincing soldiers to abandon their posts, and in many cases, it worked. But it was the scene at the Vatican embassy that became the most iconic and misunderstood piece of psychological theater. The story of U.S. troops blasting rock music at Noriega became an instant legend, repeated with increasing embellishment. The playlist supposedly included I Fought the Law, Welcome to the Jungle, and other pointed selections. Some true, some invented after the fact. Reality was more mundane, yes. Loud music was used. No, it wasn't a non-stop heavy metal concert aimed at torturing him into submission. The goal wasn't to cause physical harm, but to erode his sense of sanctuary, keep him awake, and remind him that the outside world had not forgotten him. The entertainment value of the story ensured that the myth grew far larger than the tactic itself. Meanwhile, the U.S. government engaged in its own messaging campaign to maintain domestic support. Press briefings emphasized precision, restraint, and moral clarity. Officials spoke of protecting American lives, restoring democracy, and stopping drug trafficking. Rarely did they dwell on the complexity of urban combat or the civilian cost of the operation. These omissions didn't go unnoticed by the international observers, who accused Washington of sanitizing the narrative for domestic consumption. The tug-of-war over public perception didn't end when the fighting did. For months, debates continued over casualty numbers, legality, and proportionality. Human rights organizations compiled their own reports. Panamanian citizens, newly free but surrounded by destruction, offered testimonies that contradicted official tallies. The media, eager to investigate, highlighted inconsistencies between government statements and on-the-ground realities. Operation Just Cause became a study in how modern warfare is fought on two fronts, the battlefield and the broadcast. Military victories could be decisive, but narrative victories depended upon who told the story, when they told it, and how much of the truth they chose to show. In Panama, the United States won the military campaign quickly, but the perception war proved far more complicated, revealing that in the modern era, winning hearts and minds requires a different kind of firepower. Looking back at Operation Just Cause, the invasion stands as one of the most decisive, controversial, and instructive military actions of the late 20th century. It arrived at a geopolitical crossroads, after Vietnam, but before Desert Storm. After the fall of dictatorships across Latin America, but before the U.S. adopted regime change as a broader policy tool. It was a hinge moment, and how the world remembers it depends heavily on whether the lens is strategic, political, legal, or humanitarian. Militarily, the operation was a clean victory measured by speed, precision, and overwhelming force. In less than a week, the United States dismantled an entire national military, installed a new government, seized all critical terrain, and captured its primary target. The PDF, fragmented and outmatched, never had a chance to mount a coherent defense. From the Pentagon's perspective, Just Cause validated nearly everything the post-Vietnam reforms had been trying to build: rapid dominance, joint operations, night fighting, and the seamless integration of special operations forces. It was the live fire proof that the American military had entered a new era where technology, coordination, and tempo could decide battles before the opponent even understood what was happening. But a clean military victory does not necessarily translate into a clean historical narrative. Politically, Just Cause raised uncomfortable questions about intervention, sovereignty, and the role of superpowers in shaping the destinies of smaller nations. The United States framed the invasion as a humanitarian and democratic necessity, removing a dictator who had brutalized his people, corrupted elections, and threatened U.S. lives. Yet critics pointed out that Noriega had been tolerated, funded, and even protected by American intelligence agencies for years, only to become a villain once his usefulness expired. The sudden moral urgency felt selective, the timing convenient, and the justifications flexible enough to apply to a dozen other regimes that the United States showed no interest in toppling. Internationally, the reaction reflected these contradictions. Some governments quietly approved, relieved to see Noriega's destabilizing influence eliminated. Others condemned the invasion as a violation of international law, warning that it established a precedent for unilateral military action under the banner of protecting democracy. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution criticizing the operation, though it carried no enforcement power. Still, it signaled global discomfort with a model of justice that involved tanks crossing borders to arrest a single man. The humanitarian and civilian toll complicates the legacy further. While the U.S. military made efforts to minimize casualties and collateral damage, the reality of urban warfare ensured that civilians paid a high price. Neighborhoods like El Chorrillo suffered devastation that could not be explained away by carefully worded briefings. Casualty estimates remain disputed, with figures ranging from around 200 civilians in U.S. reports to over 1,000 in independent investigations. For the families who lost homes and loved ones, the operation's clean narrative never matched the reality of burned buildings, missing relatives, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life shattered overnight. Yet despite these wounds, Panama's trajectory in the decades that followed is one of cautious stability. Freed from military rule, the country transitioned towards civilian governance, market reforms, and democratic elections. The canal turnover in 1999 proceeded smoothly, and Panama eventually became one of Latin America's more prosperous and politically consistent nations. This outcome is often cited by supporters of the invasion as proof that Just Cause succeeded not just militarily, but in its long-term aims. Critics counter that Panama's success owes more to international reforms and international economic forces than to the invasion itself. Both interpretations hold some truth. In the broader context of U.S. military history, Just Cause occupies a unique place. It was the prototype for future operations where rapid, overwhelming force aimed to topple hostile regimes before they could react. It prefigured the air-ground coordination seen in Desert Storm, the emphasis on special operations seen in Afghanistan, and the quick strike philosophy that underpinned early phases of the Iraq invasion. But unlike those later conflicts, Panama did not devolve into a long-term insurgency or nation-building quagmire. It ended swiftly, leaving just enough ambiguity to allow advocates and critics alike to claim they were proven right. For the American public, the operation became a brief moment of clarity in an otherwise turbulent era. It demonstrated competence, restored some faith in the military after a lingering psychological scars of Vietnam, and positioned the United States as a confident global actor. But for scholars and policymakers, Just Cause remains a case study in the double-edged nature of decisive power. It showed that military success does not eliminate ethical dilemmas. It highlighted the tension between righteousness and realpolitik. And it exposed how quickly public support can shift when wars are short, victories are clear, and casualties are low. In retrospect, Operation Just Cause stands as both a triumph and a warning. It proved what the U.S. military could accomplish when doctrine, training, and technology aligned with political will. It also showed how easily moral clarity can be clouded when geopolitical convenience and humanitarian justification intersect. Panama emerged from the operation changed, the United States emerged confident, and the world emerged more aware that even small wars can cast long shadows. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?